What's up, Twinks? Welcome back, Music Corner. As always, my name is Lavender. I will be your host as we talk about music today. The subject of this video, as you can see, top 50 albums of 2013. Yes, twice a year going back to 2020, we have been doing a little recapping, a little retrospective, a look back on the 2010s, aka the decade that made me a music fan in the first place, and looking at what has aged gracefully and what maybe hasn't. And I know I've talked about tough lists in the past, but this might have been the toughest one so far. I listened to about 150 albums to narrow down this list, and more so than any other year, my opinions are really, really different than they were at the time. There are a lot of albums I really loved back then that I'm just not as fond of anymore, and there are also a lot of albums that I either didn't really hear or didn't really get when I first heard them as like a 13-year-old that they're starting to make a lot more sense to me now. So without further ado, let's just jump into the list. I think we're going to take the first half pretty fast, get into more detail on some of the later ones, some of my favorite albums of the year. You can jump around this video in the link in the description if you want to watch it in little segments, as well as you can find a list of all of the albums I'm talking about here today in case you would like to listen to any of them for yourself. Let's get it. Number 50, The Drones, some Aussie punk and garage rock from before anyone knew who King Gizzard was on their album Icy Seaweed. And at number 49, Casey Musgraves brings her indelible country charm on Same Trailer, Different Park. At number 48, The Flaming Lips with one of their most interesting third stage, late stage albums of their discography, the very hazy, very surprisingly blissful at times, The Terror. And at number 47, Iceage return with Yours Truly. Not quite the peak of their discography yet. They still have more room to grow, but still undeniably a step forward from their debut, and still a very good album that holds up well on its own. Number 46, a dark and very painful singer-songwriter experience courtesy of Chelsea Wolfe with the very introspective, very meditative, very dark Pain is Beauty. And at number 45, Ichiko Aoba with Zero O, an album that was totally not on my radar in 2013, but thanks to her sort of recent outing as a critical darling, it has exposed me to a lot of her earlier material. This is one of my favorites of hers, a real treat of a listen, Japanese folk project that is intimate but still very compositionally expansive and playful. Great songs, great tunes here, great performances, great record. And at number 44, we have Ka with The Knight's Gambit, a extremely reserved hip-hop album, hip-hop experience. This thing, the conceptual ties that run through a lot of these songs are really fascinating, really interesting, and Ka is just not only a confrontational performer despite the intimacy of the recording style, but also just a remarkable writer. It's already water time, sponsored by Lululemon. At number 43, we have Waxahachie with Cerulean Salt, another singer-songwriter album, and one of the records that really turned me into a big Waxahachie fan originally. And at number 42, Pusha T with My Name Is My Name, a hip-hop project that is extremely hard-hitting in its highlights, and there are a lot of highlights, a little bit inconsistent, but still, in my opinion, a good first step for Pusha T, setting up what he would go on to achieve afterwards. And at number 41, Beach Fossils with Clash the Truth Expand on their sounds of indie pop, dream pop, and bedroom pop, two great results. At number 40, Chvrches with their exciting electropop debut album, The Bones of What You Believe, a record that set high expectations for the band with which they've never really even come close to matching again. And at number 39, Steven Wilson of Porcupine Tree with his solo prog experience, The Raven That Refused to Sing. And at number 38, Killer Mike, LP, teaming up for the second time, though this time as both MCs on the debut Run the Jewels album, Run the Jewels. And at number 37, the full studio debut album from Forest Swords, Engravings. This really interesting sort of ambient and dub parallel electronic soundscape experience. There is a lot of interesting conceptual strings being pulled out from various different music genres throughout this really interesting, really well-textured album. And at number 36, John Hopkins with Immunity, this very progressive and electronica-influenced dance record. A lot of gorgeous, glistening sounds, a lot of long, winding compositions, and just great stuff for people who love dance music and love electronica to just have a little bit of poise to it. Number 35, Kurt Weill, Waking on a Pretty Days, with one of his most beloved records where he really dives into the wandering, psychedelic, and soulful sounds of this folk music. It is a little bit lazy, a little bit meandering, but in a way that I find extremely endearing and have continued to with Kurt's music to this day. And at number 34, an album that I didn't expect to like now as much as I did at the time, Justin Timberlake with the 2020 Experience. This thing is really an elevated pop sensation. There is so much good songwriting here, so many expansive compositions, so many great ideas coming together. This is a big record that has a lot going for it, and to this day, I just still like it quite a bit. Then in hard contrast, number 33, we have the final Altar of Plagues album, Teethed Glory and Injury, one of the most interesting and experimental and versatile black metal albums of the entire 2010s. I was not tuned into this album when it originally came out. I heard it sometime later, but God, when I heard it for the first time, it's almost hard to believe that this is an album that was released in 2013. And number 32, an album that there is quite a bit of hate for out there in the world, one that I loved at the time, and while I don't love it as much now, I still see a lot of merit in what Arctic Monkeys do with AM. Even though this is far from the most experimental or outside-the-box move that the band could have made following their worst album at the time, Suck It and See, it is a turn to something that is more instantaneous, more catchy, a lot cooler, a lot more infectious, and it's no surprise to me that this thing caught on with the Lana Del Rey neighborhood Tumblr crowd because it's just that effortless. And at number 31, One O Tricks Point Never with R+7, the most purely synthetic and digital release in this very eruptive creative period for Daniel. This is not one of my favorite One O Tricks Point Never projects. However, I like the experiment that it indulges in quite a bit, and it has a lot of the very digital nostalgia feel that One O Tricks Point Never's music has always maintained. Number 30, another album that I wasn't crazy about the first time that I heard it years ago, the Laura Marling project, Once I Was an Eagle. It really wasn't until I heard her great 2020 record, Song for Our Daughter, that I went back, revisited a lot of the Laura Marling discography, and to me, this is the one that stands out as probably her best project before that one, and I really like it. The more I listen to it, the more I enjoy it, and in another 10 years, it wouldn't surprise me if this was even further up the list. At number 29, the long-awaited return of My Bloody Valentine, bringing the heavy, crushing sounds of shoegaze back, recontextualizing them for the mid-2010s on their great album, MBV. And at number 28, I gotta say it, Macross with Sailor Wave, the Sailor Moon themed vaporwave album that had me by my throat when I first heard it back in 2013, and it has never wavered on me. This thing is a fun neon explosion of soulful dance, vaporwave, future funk. It is a wonderful combination of sounds and styles coming together to make something that I continue to find completely irresistible. And at number 27, we've got Jenny Hval with Innocence is Kinky. I think a lot of people were not necessarily tuned into Jenny's music until 2015's Apocalypse Girl. However, Innocence is Kinky is arguably an even more raw presentation of her style as a songwriter and the sentiments that she is dabbling in. Take the title track, the opener to this record, which really throws you into the deep end with some of the explorative and introspective sexual content that Jenny is dealing with head on. This is a great spacey listening experience which has punchy electronic instrumentation which contrasts with her gentle but very honest and very earnest vocal performances extremely well. I like this record a lot. And at number 26, Fuck Buttons with Slow Focus, what is perhaps the final Fuck Buttons record we will ever get. I think this was a great follow-up to their two previous works that explored and expanded upon the sounds of the dizzying noise pop that they had built their stylings on. I love the long compositions here. I love just how many sounds and styles are being worked together and forced into this record. It was a pretty great note for the band to go out on, and Benjamin just picking up and carrying on with Blank Mass continuing to be a great music project is no surprise to me given how good this album is. And we're in the top half of the list with number 25, the Flatbush Zombies mixtape, Better Off Dead. I know that these guys sort of tapered out as a group. It's been 5 years since we last got a new Flatbush Zombies project, and they've been mostly wading into various solo works since then, which I get, but listening to this mixtape reignites the fire of why I believed so much in them as a trio in the first place. This thing is just hard-hitting, uncompromising, brooding, intense, great, well-written, well-performed hip-hop. The chemistry that the three of them have together and the way that they play off of it extremely well. The distinct elements that they bring as a group. Eric's extremely wordy lyrical ability, Michi's extremely distinctive voice. There is just so much to love about Flatbush Zombies, particularly in this era of their career. This thing is not on streaming because it's a mixtape with heavy use of samples, but God, if you have never heard it, do yourself a favor. At number 24, we've got Future of the Left with How to Stop Your Brain in an Accident. My personal favorite of their material, a really playful, tongue-in-cheek take on post-hardcore, but one who does not let its playfulness get in the way of hard-hitting social commentary and even harder-hitting performances from the entire band. If post-hardcore is your thing, you're definitely going to want to check this out because it is a really creative and really enjoyable take on the style. And at number 23, Queens of the Stone Age with Like Clockwork, their best record in a very, very long time. It is just a more dark, compositionally expansive collection of material from Queens of the Stone Age that is much more willing to be bold, to be sonically adventurous, to be lyrically abstract and intriguing in ways that have not been since. There is just so much to like about this record that the band has consistently failed to replicate on almost all of their other projects. Number 22, we've got the Haxon Cloak with Excavation, a really, really interesting ambient music experience, one that, unlike a lot of ambient projects, is not afraid to play with bursts of sonic intensity. However, they are often placed in such methodical pinpoint ways or really cleverly looped that it doesn't really distract from what feels like gently fading out of consciousness while listening to this record. It is dark and a little bit bleak at times, but I would hardly call this thing depraved or depressing. And number 21, an album I think everybody knew was going to show up here, Sky Ferreira's debut, Nighttime, My Time, an album that to this day has not received a follow-up. It seems like it is stuck in label hell forever, and while there have been some iffy reviews of her performances and newer singles and recent material, go back and listen to this album, and it will pretty much instantly remind you of why everyone who came of age in this era of music has such affinity for Chvrches and is hoping for her to come back and come back strong so badly, because she just deserves it. At number 20, we have got Unknown Mortal Orchestra with 2, their second, I suppose, self-titled album. Yeah, this is just a great collection of gently psychedelic indie pop jams. These things are fun. They are instantaneous. The hooks are extremely catchy, and given how reserved they are in their nature, quite often the ability that this album has to just stick with me every single time I hear it is really, really impressive. I think it's a mark of great songwriting and, honestly, even better performances. And at number 19, the surprise dropped self-titled Beyonce album. I think this was really Beyonce's first step in evolving past being a pop star into a pop auteur. This thing didn't really need to have number 1 hits. It was a little bit more conceptual of a sonic listening experience. It began her sort of low promo approach to a lot of her music, the way that it was just surprise dropped. And yeah, this thing was a big deal, and I think the incredible run of material that Beyonce has followed it up with in the decades since only further heightens how important this is to her discography and how important of a first step it was for her coming out of her shell as a mature, grown, as I said, pop auteur. Number 18, another project. There are weirdly many of these on this list that is failed to have been followed up on in the decades since. The new The Knife album, Shaking the Habitual, though Fever Ray has released a pair of solo projects in the meantime. But yeah, God, what a great album. What an interesting, experimental, bold, and ambitious electronic music listening experience. I think some people who were around for their pair of massively acclaimed albums in the 2000s may think they understand what The Knife is about, but Shaking the Habitual is such a dive into outside the box, wild, fun, very fun, experimental electronic music. I recommend this record quite a bit because it is a phenomenally interesting listening experience. Number 17, The World is a Beautiful Place, and I Am No Longer Afraid to Die with Whenever, If Ever. This is a great little emo parallel project that is a little bit progressive-y in its instrumentation and also has a lot of really rewarding influences from the worlds of like folk and Midwestern emo. I think if this album came out in like 2018 or 2019 at the height of the underground emo craze of that time, it would be a lot more acclaimed than it is. Not that there isn't a lot of love for this record out there. I just think that this band laid a lot of groundwork for so much of a thriving underground emo scene that exists right now. I think they helped to mold and shape the sound and presentation of that style and did it with a pair of lovely, lovely records, both of which I really enjoy. This one, still to this day, probably my favorite of theirs, and all I can say is that I feel like it deserves more credit. Number 16, Foxygen joins the long name parade with We Are the 21st Century Ambassadors of Peace and Magic, I think. And this is a great little record that saw Foxygen honing in some of the insane, off-the-walls, bouncy, Rolling Stonesy, indie rock jamming of their debut album and refocusing it into a little bit more of an intimate indie folk sound and presentation, but God, one that I absolutely adore. The songwriting on this is so good. Jonathan Rado is such a gifted musician, arranger, multi-instrumentalist, and Sam France is just the prototypical charismatic frontman. The fact that Foxygen did not achieve more while they were around is stunning to me because these two are just a match made in heaven. At number 15, ASAP Rocky Long Long.Live.A AP. In my opinion, this is A$AP Rocky at his commercial peak, out of the cloud rap shell of his debut album, which I adore, and into something that is a little bit more universal, a little bit more easily digestible, and packed with other various wonderful talents along the way. And the result is just an infectious, fun, very consistent, very enjoyable listening experience. The fact that in the 10 years since this, not only has Rocky only released 2 albums, but that they had both, in their own ways, failed to live up to his first 2 albums is kind of surprising, because this album just sounds so effortlessly cool. It sounds like a thing that A$AP Rocky would be able to do forever. Regardless, we've always got the highlights from those latter 2 records and the entirety of his first 2 records to fall back on and credit him as continuing to be one of the most interesting voices in all of hip-hop right now. Number 14, we've got Tim Hecker with Virgins, the darker, somewhat more dissonant, and a little bit more chaotic follow-up to 2011's brilliant Rave Death. And while this album by comparison doesn't strike me quite as epic of an ambient listening experience, this is a lot more concerned with making something that is scary, deconstructive, self-reflective. It is very dark. It is occasionally very haunting, but I think that is the majesty and the beauty of it. It is a really chilling ambient listen, one that in its entirety tires me out. I cannot listen to this whole album and then run a marathon. It's just that involved of a listening experience if you're willing to give yourself to the depths of sonic texture that it presents, and the results are really, really good. I love this record, even if it isn't Rave Death. At number 13, Cage the Elephant with Melophobia. For a lot of people in 2023, it might be difficult to realize just how extreme and unpredictable of a sonic shift this record was. It really sort of changed the outlook that a lot of people had on this band, me included. Not that I was ever a hater, but after really, really not enjoying Thank You, Happy Birthday, I was stunned by how much I love this record. It's heavier use of distortion, it's psychedelic tones, it's more exciting and infectious songwriting. Every song here is just so snappy, it just burrows into your head and stays there. It is textbook great songwriting that is surrounded by instrumentation that has much more of a pulse, much more life to it than either of the first 2 Cage the Elephant records, and I just enjoy it quite a bit to this day. I think it's a little bit of an outlier in their discography, given just how sonically brash it is at its most destructive moments. And number 12, people aren't going to like this one. There's a couple coming up that people aren't going to like, starting with this one, a pop rock record that took the world by storm, and that as like a fucking 13-year-old girl I was really, really into. Still does it for me. 1975, self-titled. This album fucks. I don't care what anybody says. The hooks are great. The charisma that Matty Healy presents as a frontman is irresistible. While I don't think it is their best project to date, I do think it is a wonderful starting point for the band that not only established their extremely defining stylistic motifs, both instrumentally and lyrically, but also just presented a bunch of great goddamn songs that are still in my rotation today, from like Sex and Chocolate and Girls and The City and Robbers and Menswear. This thing is just packed full of instant, infectious pop rock bangers, and while I understand why people don't like it and why people don't like him and this band, I do. Another album that people are retroactively pretending not to enjoy anymore, at number 11, the new Chance the Rapper album, Acid Rap. No, this record is not new, because when it was new, it was pretty universally acclaimed for Chance's laid back but extremely well-written, casual flows, fun songs, great features. This thing is really a big party full of great, talented artists weaved in throughout, and I love it. Since the big dayification of Chance's discography, it's become easier and easier for everyone to retroactively pretend that Chance the Rapper is a bad artist and always has been, and I just disagree with that, because I can go back and listen to acid rap and feel how casually, infectiously fun it all is, and remember that there was a time when I adored this album and Chance's music as a whole. This album isn't perfect, but it's a damn fun listening experience who deserves to be taken out of context from the rest of Chance the Rapper's discography and praised individually. Top 10, baby. Let's fucking go. And by let's go, I mean let's deflate the energy immediately by talking about number 10, the Mark Kozelek and Jimmy LaValle album, Perils from the Sea. As I've said many times on this channel and will continue to say as we cover Mark's work extensively in the coming years, I think that Mark Kozelek is an asshole, and I hold him fully responsible for his own actions. He's also one of the most talented musicians in all of music, and given that I started this whole venture praising his music both in 2020 and in 2010, it's something that I feel obligated to continue doing as he continued to release incredible fucking material for the entire decade. And Perils from the Sea is no different, as this is like one of the best fucking folktronica albums of all time. The combination of these really poignant, really punchy synthetic sounds from Jimmy and Mark's brilliant storytelling, and not necessarily the way he composes a song, but the way he composes a narrative and the way it unfolds in song is just brilliant. There are so many highlights on this record. It is such a great sort of projector prediction for what would come on Benji, but with a much more indie folk inspired sound. I just adore this record. It's amazing. At number 9, an album who is much, much, much easier to love, Daft Punk, Random Access Memories, what we now know is Daft Punk's final album, and what is about to get a 10-year anniversary 10-year anniversary deluxe reissue, which is giving what might be the last new material we ever hear from Daft Punk. When I heard this album for the first time, I wasn't convinced, and that is an unfortunate overlay, because it should not have taken me this long to realize just how great what Daft Punk does here really is. This is less purely innovative than their best material on Homework and Discovery. However, this is just like a grand celebration of music. The collaborators that they bring in, like Pharrell, Julian Casablancas, Nile Rodgers, Panda Bear, songs like Contact, Giorgio by Marauder. This is just an amazing, epic, galaxy-sized celebration of everything electronic music and Daft Punk themselves. And in retrospect, it really does feel like a great note to go out on. Daft Punk have always had a special ability about them to make electronic music feel conceptual, and this is that ability articulated to its absolute peak. This is a wonderful record, a wonderful listening experience whose greatness really snuck up on me, and I've seen a lot of people who feel similarly. Number 8, one of my favorite artists of the decade who we've talked about a good bit before and will continue to talk about, Julia Holter with Loud City Song. This is really the first time that her discography weaves into the world of overwhelming critical acclaim, and even though I love her first 2 projects, this is a major step forward. This thing is a short but extremely blissful, gorgeously written, arranged, and performed collection of dream pop and chamber pop tracks that, frankly, I find completely fucking irresistible. While nothing here will touch the levels of experimentation that she'll go on to produce on record like Aviary or even on the follow-up to this album, it is just the tight, infectious songwriting and the beautiful, beautiful sound play throughout this album that make it completely irresistible to me. Every time I think that an album that is more conceptual, more grand, a bigger undertaking might be better than this, I just listen to this again and it wins me over all over again. At number 7, the Nicholas Jar Reign of Majesty continues with the Darkside record, Psychic, one that I had always loved, but when the newest Darkside record, Spiral, came out, and I liked it a lot, it really made me go back and revisit this, and it's another album that really blows me away that this came out in 2013. It feels so ahead of its time, it feels so creative, it feels so innovative for fusing sounds like art rock with this really poised, artsy, minimal electronica. It doesn't even seem like this could possibly be the same artist who makes Against All Logic. And yeah, what these two do here is just wonderful, very impressive, very sonically poised, poignant, detailed, textured. The words that I've been applying to a lot of the electronic and ambient music that have talked about throughout this list all apply to this. It might be those principles applied perhaps the best of any album that I've heard from 2013, and the results are just marvelous, whimsical, extremely enjoyable. Number 6, you knew he would be here. My boy, my king, daddy, James Blake with Overgrown. I wonder if he would think it was weird that I called him daddy. Yes, unsurprisingly, one of my favorite artists of the decade will appear on these lists pretty much anytime he puts any material out. And while we will talk extensively about one of the songs on this album in particular, I just want to say that the first half of this thing is absolutely all killer, no filler, and the second half is no slouch either. In terms of the arc of James Blake's career, this is less experimental, less electronica focused than his self-titled debut album, which, as you know, I completely adore, but I don't think he loses any of his charm and his magnetic vocal ability in that transition. These songs are R&B inspired, but chilling and spacey in a way that almost channels some of his really sparse electronic ballads in his early days. And what it does is just paint these brilliant little musical landscapes with which James Blake can just vocally play in a way that is completely intoxicating. This record's loudest and quietest moments are equally as engaging from a soundplay standpoint. I just can't think of anybody else who manages to be such a great vocalist, purely in terms of singing talent and the ability to apply his singing talent, but also such a great and masterful composer, songwriter, producer, arranger. This album sounds brilliant from start to finish, and it's just yet another testimony to the immense talent that is James Blake. Top 5, here we go. Number 5, an album that I've had a bit of an interesting journey with because at the time it was a personal favorite of mine, and then this artist went on to do much more darker and more experimental things, and in retrospect, I started to not like this album as much, but coming back to it recently, I just cannot help but appreciate everything about Earl Sweatshirt's Doris. Yeah, this album, man, it really does it for me. Just the great hooks, the great collaborations, the playful stylings of it. It's like Earl taking a first step into the darkness that would go on to define much of his career, while still leaving another foot in the silly-ass, odd-futured Loiter Squad shenaniganry that he came from. For every one song on this record that is serious as fuck, like Chum, there are 2 songs that have genuinely laugh-out-loud moments on them, whether it is Earl playing off of his funny, also very young collaborators like Vince Staples and Mac Miller really well, or just himself being himself in ways that only Earl can be. The appreciation I've grown for this record is twofold, both what I've talked about, the place that it exists for within Earl's discography, and the uniqueness of its style and presentation. I just can't really imagine any other artist being able to split these 2 lines so well and so distinctly in the way that Earl does on record. I really appreciate this thing. If it's been a while since you've heard it, maybe it's worth a re-listen, because a re-listen certainly changed my perspective on it for the better. And at number 4, even as I still, to this day, 10 years later, have real life black metal fans as friends telling me this is fake, this is poser shit, this is not real black metal, I cannot help but adore what Deafheaven does with Sunbather. If you're somehow unfamiliar, this is a bit of a controversial record in the black metal community because it interpolates in large parts the sounds of shoegaze and post-rock into these bold, big, wandering compositions that are all centered around the style and often the subject matter of more conventional black metal. And yes, while if you're looking for something that is a little bit more straightforward, raw, intense, blow your head off type black metal, there are no doubt passages of this project that may come off as boring to you, but if you are into what is reflexively and painfully known as hipster metal, this thing is probably like your Bible. And yeah, I love this project. I love it for the blurry, hazy, shoegazy type sound play, both of which are so unfamiliar for black metal. And in a similar way to an album that I talked about last year from Panopticon, I really think this is what the style needs: people to innovate and expand on its principles. And I'll just never understand the black metal purists out there who refuse to even acknowledge just how great this thing is. Number 3, an album that was pretty much universally acclaimed upon release, but one that everybody seems to think is great, but nobody seems to think is, like, amazing. Well, I think it's amazing. Savages with Silence Yourself. This is an incredible post-punk experience, one that manages to be both brooding at points and at other points extremely intense, exciting. The performances on this record are raw as fuck. They are intense. They are pummeling. They are uncompromising. I just can't think of another album from around this era that does specifically this so well. Sometimes when it comes to post-punk, you can be classified as one of these more classic, brooding, depressy post-punk bands, or one of the more sonically intense, more maybe political and culturally focused and more punk-y of the post-punk bands. Well, Savages is both. They pull off both on this record, and not only once or twice. On this album, the band manages to blur the line between some of the defining stylistic pillars of post-punk, fusing them all together into a record that is both extremely intense to listen to, but also meditative, self-reflective, and dark in the ways that so much classic post-punk is. It's impressive. That's all I can really say about it. It is just extremely impressive from a writing standpoint, from a performance standpoint. Everything about this is really just wonderful, and I am happy to continue letting it pummel me for years to come. Number 2 is an album that I did not expect to be this high, just in concept. I knew it would be very high. I like this record a lot, but part of coming into this project, what I thought about this album in particular, and the way that it has been mythologized as so crucial to pop music's transition from the pop star to the relentlessly down-to-earth underdog, is that was a lot of show, and the record really is that important, but the actual material on this thing, is it that good? And upon revisiting it, this is not alt hype. Lord's Pure Heroine is really, really good. Yes, the mythology around Lord's down-to-earth demeanor sort of infected pop music for years to come, but it is really just so compelling all across this record. The songwriting feels so universal. It feels so achingly youthful, so earnestly naive in its most blissful moments that I just adore it as a listening experience. I think you could have made a really bad mistake by blowing this up to arena-sized proportions, and the ability of Lorde and her songwriters and producers to keep this thing as skeletal, as composed, as stark as it is, adds the poise and maturity that it needs to contrast its youthful lyricism and themes, and the result is just a stunning pop experience. Not only is Lorde a songwriter that is serving well above her years on this record, but it is also just a consistent, all-killer, no-filler, straight-to-the-point run of great pop songs. And at that point, what more could I ask for? This album is innovative, it is influential, but it's not too nebulous to be enjoyed. In fact, it is achingly authentic, and that's awesome. That's amazing. That's exactly what I fucking love about it. And maybe in a different year, it would not be this high, it would not be on the pedestal in terms of best albums of the year, but as a full decade now separates us from the bomb that was Royals and this album, I continue to appreciate it more and more and more. Number 1. Much like the past 2 years, James Blake self-titled in 2011, Lana Del Rey's Born to Die in 2012, I think, for those who know me, there will be very little surprise to what comes next. But unlike those other two albums, I think this might be a little bit predictable for everyone. If there was ever a consensus album of the year for 2013, it was easily this. One major publication after another praising it relentlessly, topping their lists with it, and just as many indie blogs and music YouTubers and social media figures also lumping acclaim onto this thing. I would call it pretty easily the most universally acclaimed album of 2013, which feels lame to stick it at the top. But after hearing all of these records through a number of times, I get it. There's just nothing else as good as Vampire Weekend's Modern Vampires of the City. This album is amazing. This album is the maturity of Vampire Weekend from their first two albums, which are at points very exciting, but also, particularly their sophomore album, very flawed. But yes, on this album you have songs like Diane Young that could fit amongst the energetic, exciting, and extremely clever track lists of their self-titled debut. But the previous iteration of Vampire Weekend before this record could not have made, say, Hannah Hunt. The maturity from a songwriting perspective and the realization that in the right moments of emotional peak, less is more, create beauty on this album in so many different ways. From the beauty of intimacy on this thing's quietest, most reserved tracks, to the beauty of patience on songs that wait for just the right moment to erupt into their most climactic point. And to the beauty of pulling up the goddamn Genius lyrics page to break down exactly what the fuck Ezra Koenig is talking about and realizing that it's kind of amazing. This thing is a little bit gloomier, I would say, than their previous two albums, though it is still firmly that very preppy style of indie rock that really only Vampire Weekend can do this well. I just can't think of much that I would want to change about this album. Not only does it make so much sense for Vampire Weekend at this point in their career, and it is such a stunning and exciting step forward, packed full of such good songwriting, good performances, and great ideas all over the place, but it also just feels like the perfect album for 2013. I think the stars aligned for this thing, which is why so many critics were so quick to mythologize it. And 10 years later, I think that they were still right. This is still a wonderful album. This is still an extremely smart and well-made album in every sense of the word. And it's still an album that I love to this day, and one that I occasionally just get a random desire to listen to throughout. No part of this ever feels like a chore. No part of it ever feels like work. These songs just run together in blissful, wonderful, engaging excitement from start to finish. And to me, it was really never even a competition. This is definitely my favorite album of 2013. And that is it. Thank you for watching. Another albums list in the books. The top 50 songs of 2013 will come out later this year in September. And in the meantime, there will be a new bitching about the Hot 100 video coming out soon, because I have to cover the first couple months of the year. Then there will be the follow-up to the worst hits of the 2010s video, and then there will be another recap, and then we'll basically be at the midway point of the year already, which is crazy. Thanks for watching. Link in the description to watch more stuff and to see what else I'm up to. I review new albums on my blog every week, and that's it. If you know James Blake, don't tell him I called him daddy.